everyone. It's noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. As we get settled in for this power hour today, I'd first like to read a prepared land acknowledgement I prepared. And I do apologize for all the construction noises. It seems my landlord is doing some stuff downstairs, so hopefully that doesn't disrupt things too much. So I know that we're all tuning in from different areas in the US today, so it makes a concrete land acknowledgement a little more difficult, but as a separated Indigenous person, I think it's important that we do so. I want to start out by talking about Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest and Rocky Mountain National Park, where our Front Range Pika project originated. Those areas were Ute and Cheyenne ancestral land before the federal government claimed it and turned it into a national park. Where I'm currently tuning in from, I'm occupying Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe ancestral land. If you aren't sure whose land you're on today, I would encourage that you find out after this hour. I would also ask that everyone consider what they can do today to actively further the reconciliation process with Indigenous peoples, especially as Indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by the current pandemic due to environmental injustices that are the direct result of historical displacements as well as current and continuous broken promises. So today is the fourth day of Colorado Endangered Species Week, and today we're focusing on Pika. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this power hour to talk about this little critter and what we can do to advocate for them. So I'm Chris, I'm from Rocky Mountain Wild, the host of the power hour today and also Colorado Endangered Species Week. And today we're going to be joined with Joe Varner from Colorado Mesa University and Megan Mueller from Rocky Mountain Wild. So Joe will be discussing Pika basics, its current status, research, and other topics. And then Megan will talk about the citizen science projects that we have to help protect the species. And after that, we're going to be opening up for the question and answer portion of the hour, starting with the questions that were submitted upon registration and through our social media and email. If you do have a question that you didn't ask during that time, if you scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom menu, there'll be a little chat and you'll be able to chat it directly to me and we can add it to the queue of questions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe.
All right, so hang on 1 second. We'll see if the screen sharing situation works. All right, can you all see the screen? Does that look okay? Can you hear me okay? Chris? Okay, I'm seeing a couple of thumbs up on the reaction, so I'm going to go ahead and charge ahead. Thank you guys all so much for being here today. My name is Johanna Varner. I also go by Pika Joe, and I'm really excited to tell you guys a little bit about background about Pikas, a little bit about the research that I'm doing now. But I thought that I would start by just giving you guys just kind of a brief introduction to myself and my journey as a Pika biologist. So I actually have a background originally in engineering and in molecular biology, and had kind of a quarter life crisis in my early 20s in which I decided that I really didn't want to spend time cooped up in a cold, dark room by myself. And I really, really liked Pikas. So I've been a Pika fan for much longer than I've been a Pika researcher. And I came to meet a woman who had done her PhD on Pikas, and I asked, how do I become a Pika biologist? And she gave me some great advice and took me on as a graduate student. So I actually did my PhD research at University of Utah, but I was mostly working in the Columbia River Gorge with this really atypical population of Pikas. This is a picture of one of the Pikas from my marked population. And we were looking at their diet and behavior in these really, really low elevations down to about 150 feet above sea level. So really different kind of habitat than what we have here in the Rocky Mountains. I won't have time to talk much about that today, but if you have any questions about it, I'd be totally happy to answer them in the Q&A section. As part of my graduate research, I also was helped to co-found a citizen science program called Cascades Pika Watch. And Cascades Pika Watch was specifically founded to look and monitor these really low elevation pikas. And we're working right now, there was a really big wildfire that swept through the area in a couple of years ago, the Eagle Creek fire that you guys may have heard of. And so that's really what we are doing right now, is kind of trying to mobilize to be able to find out how the population is responding to that disturbance. The last 4.5 years, I've been a faculty member at Colorado Mesa University in Grand Junction, so on the Western Slope. And since then, have kind of switched my research interests and working in the La Salle Mountains right now. And I'm going to be telling you a little bit about that research in a little bit. So you guys are all here because you already know at least enough about pikas to know that they are the single most adorable organism ever. And in fact, they were empirically voted to be one of the cutest mammals in a very, very highly scientific poll that took place a couple of years ago. Pika's scientific name, Okatona princeps, actually means little chief hare, which denotes both that pikas are closely related to rabbits and hares, they're in the lagomorph order, and also that they are extremely cheeky. They inhabit mountain ranges in Western North America, so places that look like this. We typically find them in these rock slides and boulder fields that we collectively refer to as talus. And they tend to have kind of preference for talus where the most of the rocks are roughly 1 to 3 feet in diameter. In places in the southern Rocky Mountains, like where many of us are coming from, we find pikas above about 8,000 or 9,000 feet in elevation. But as I mentioned, in places in the Pacific Northwest, and I think that I see a couple of Cascades Pika Watch folks who have tuned in, that you will find pikas at much lower elevation, so down very close to sea level. And this distribution, we think, is limited both by a sensitivity to heat stress and a limited ability to disperse between patches of habitat. One thing many people might not realize is that pikas are actually the only lagomorph, so the only member of the rabbit and hare order that vocalizes, and they are indeed quite vocal. So they have a couple of characteristic calls. This is a call of their short call. Which sounds a little bit like a dog squeaky toy is how I describe it. And they use the short call both to alarm calls, so warnings about predators, but also to defend their territory against others and communicate. There are some pikas that also make a second kind of call. This is a long call. It's typically only made by males, and we don't actually know what its function is. So it could be something that's involved in territory defense. It could be some sort of mating kind of mate attraction kind of thing. We're not really sure, but here I'll play you a sound of a long call from a pika in the Columbia Gorge. Hopefully you guys are able to hear that. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but pikas actually also have many regional dialects. So different subspecies of the American pika have a different frequency of their call. It has to do with the width of their secondary palate. So during the summer, you guys may have seen pikas running around foraging and eating. They eat a variety of plants, grasses, flowers, even mosses, shrubs, or pine needles in some habitats. But we know that they live at these sort of high elevation places that are under the snow during the winter. And unlike most alpine mammals, pikas don't spend the winter hibernating. And there's not very much food available during this time when all of their rocky habitat is covered by snow. And so what they do is they spend the summer collecting food that they're going to eat while under the snow during the winter. So here's a picture of a pika right here for reference. And then this massive stack of vegetation is the pika's food cache, which we call a hay pile. A couple of fun facts about hay piles. A single pika can amass up to about 60 pounds of food of vegetation for the winter. And if you put that into human comparison, 60 pounds of food for a pika is equivalent to about 20,000 pounds of food for a human, not counting all of our packaging. So for anybody who feels like you have either been yourself or seen people who are out there panic buying at the grocery stores for the pandemic, this is like a lot more toilet paper than what you'd be able to fit in your car, let alone food or meat. The pikas do this by making over 5,000 different trips to the alpine meadows during the summer. And on each of these trips that they would be carrying back some amount of food in their mouth that would be the equivalent of a human going to the grocery store and carrying home 4 pounds of food, which is about 2 to 3 heads of lettuce. So remember, pikas are about the size and shape of a russet potato. Next time you guys are at the grocery store, I encourage you to go to the produce section, check out the russet potatoes, check out the heads of lettuce. Imagine being a russet potato and imagine carrying home 3 heads of lettuce in your mouth, and that is doing that 5,000 times is what pikas do all summer. In fact, a lot of times this sort of busyness of running across the talus is the easiest way to be able to even detect a pika. This is a video that I took from my PhD, and you can see that little bit of plant that just dashed across the rock slide is a pika making its hay. This video is also proof that I am a better scientist than I am filmmaker. So there you go. All right, so we're all here today, of course, because of Endangered Species Week, and pikas have been, in fact, petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act in 2009. And the reason for that petition was that there was a lot of concern about population declines in response to climate change. And so many of those concerns are based on work that was done by Eric Beaver and some colleagues in the Great Basin. So here you're looking at a map of the hydrographic Great Basin. And what they did in this study was they went and resurveyed sites that were historically occupied by pikas. So these are places where we have a museum specimen from 1920 or earlier, and they resurveyed all of the patches of suitable habitat within about 3 kilometers of the original location. So each of these points on this map represents a museum specimen from 1920 or earlier, so over 100 years ago, and all of the patches of talus within 3 kilometers of that specimen. If the point is labeled blue, that means that they were able to detect pikas within that 3 kilometer radius of the historical location. If it's orange, these are places where there are no more pikas within 3 kilometers of that original location. One of the things that they were able to show in the Great Basin is that these population declines and these sort of localized extinctions, which you may sometimes hear referred to as extirpation, they seem to be linked to climate change because they happened at places where we see warmer summer temperatures and a reduced winter snowpack. And so some of the leading hypotheses about how climate change might affect pikas is that when it gets too warm, pikas are really sensitive to heat, but rather than sort of running around and then overheating and then just dying of heat stress, what they'll do is they'll hide below the rocks in a cooler, more moist microclimate. And of course, during the summer, when they need to be constructing those big hay piles, if they're spending their time hiding underneath the rocks, then they're not going to be amassing enough food for the winter. The winter snowpack, in contrast, so typically that thick layer of snowpack actually helps act as a layer of insulation for the pikas. So any of you guys who have spent some time in the mountains during the winter, at the top of the snowpack, you know that it's very, very frequently colder than 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. But at the bottom of that really thick snowpack, it actually keeps the temperatures right close to 0 degrees. And so what this means is that if that snowpack is reduced as a result of sort of overall climate change, the pikas under the snow are actually exposed to colder temperatures. And so ironically, you know, sort of global warming and thinking about our climate moving in a warming trajectory might actually result in the pikas experiencing colder winter temperatures. One of the things that I found really interesting a few years ago when I was starting my faculty job is learning that these extinction rates seem to be a lot higher, and they tend to be more closely linked to climate in more isolated populations. So these are going to be populations of pikas that live in a sort of isolated mountain range, a place where there's not a lot of high elevation habitat. And so for that reason, I found it really interesting to try and start working in the La Salle Mountains in southern Utah. The La Salles are a really exceptionally isolated mountain range. This is a picture of the La Salles from Canyonlands National Park outside of Moab. What you can see is that there's a small handful of like 3 little sets of peaks that are above 10,000 feet. And then the mountain range itself is surrounded in all sides by about 40 miles of this sort of Utah red rock, exceedingly hot desert. The La Salles are also towards the southerly end of the distribution of pikas, and so they are a place that is super isolated, relatively low elevation, quite far south, and for that reason might be predicted to be particularly vulnerable to these kinds of climate-mediated extinctions. So what we've been doing is setting up a long-term demographic study of pikas in the La Salles. This is a picture of the cirque that I've been working at. We've been trapping the pikas and marking them with these unique colored ear tags so that we can know exactly who's who. And then we are able to tell them apart, look at who survives and who doesn't survive, collect some physiological data, and try to sort of understand these individual level predictors of survival. So I want to show you this quick video about what it's like to release a pika. It's like the best thing in the whole world. There you go.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Oh.
They're so cute. I love them so much.
That's how you get into pika research.
So that is how you get into pika research. And then I also wanted to show you guys, I mentioned before, oops, you don't need to watch that again. Thank you. That the pikas have unique dialects. And so the pikas in the La Salles actually do also have a unique dialect, one that I haven't heard anywhere else. They have sort of a two-toned short call. So rather than just making a single note, they make actually a two-note call. And so I'm going to play you this little audio of the two-toned call in the La Salles. All right. So one of the things that we are looking at in this population as sort of an indicator of population health and individual survival is stress hormones that you can measure in scat. So these glucocorticoids are a type of stress hormone. This would include something like cortisol, and that we have as a natural stress response. But of course, elevated levels of stress can lead to decreased fitness through reduced reproduction and potentially shorter survival. And we can actually detect these stress hormone metabolites. We call them glucocorticoid metabolites, or GCM. And they basically, what you detect in the scat is about a day-long average of stress. And so this is stress that's been averaged over basically the last day of the animal's life. And for that reason, we oftentimes refer to this as a chronic measure of stress, or a measure of chronic stress. The interesting thing about this is that it's going to be relatively robust to something like being chased by a weasel, right? If you're chased by a weasel, you're going to be really stressed out for a little while, and then the stress level is going to come down. Whereas what we're going to be seeing in the scat is going to be sort of averaged over a much longer period of time. This is something that's been validated by other scientists in other studies of pikas, and has been higher levels of fecal GCM have been associated with non-survival. And so that's one of the big questions that we'll be looking at in my study. I wanted to show you guys briefly today just some of our sort of fresh off the presses data. This is a little study that was done by a student of mine, Josie King, pictured here in the corner. She's just finished up her undergraduate degree at CMU, but last summer Josie spent a lot of time collecting scat from pika latrines across 3 different elevational transects in the La Salles. So she spent a lot of time hiking up and down mountains, looking for scat, collecting fresh scat. This is a picture of pika scat. They make the cutest poops in the world. They're about the size and shape of peppercorns. And they tend to stack them in these piles with the freshest pellets on top and older pellets underneath. And so what's nice about this is that we were able then to collect relatively fresh scat. She then took that scat back to the lab, extracted the stress hormones in the lab, and then measured their concentration in an assay where there's a color change in proportion to the concentration of stress hormone in the scat. And one of the really interesting things that Josie found from last summer is that, contrary to our predictions, the stress levels actually increased with elevation in this population. So here you're on the x-axis, you're looking at elevation in meters. So we're starting at about 10,000 feet elevation, we're going up to about 12,000 feet. And on the y-axis here, you're looking at the stress hormone concentration in picograms of that GCM, the stress hormone metabolite, per gram of scat. And so what we could see is we found this really significant relationship where animals at these higher elevations actually experienced higher level of stress. And this is sort of contrary to what we would predict from sort of first principles about temperature and snowpack. However, one of the things that when we started really thinking about this, we remembered that 2019 was actually a really abnormally high spring snowpack year, and there was a lot of avalanche activity in this area. So this is a picture of part of that cirque that I showed you before with no snow. Here it's covered with somewhere between 10 and 12 feet of really, really thick avalanche debris. And so what this meant is that there's a lot of animals, particularly the ones, this is all talus under here, and it's all still under snow, where these animals actually were not out, their territories were not out of the snow until mid to late August. And so by having all of this extra avalanche debris on the talus, it actually really reduced the window for summer foraging at these higher elevations and reduced that haying season, which we think might have been causing that increase in stress with elevation. So I think this study is still pretty preliminary, but I think it does a nice job of kind of highlighting some of the complexity of species-climate relationships and highlighting that this is sort of a complicated story. It's not quite as simple as we might imagine on the surface. So there are lots of other questions we're just beginning to address in this unique habitat. We're going to be looking at questions about microclimates in individual territories with special temperature sensors per Pika. We'll be looking at their vegetation, what they're eating, how much are they haying, things about parasite load and animal health, and then comparing these different aspects of Pika's survival and habitat features between the La Salle's and mainland Rocky Mountain ranges in collaboration with these two wonderful ladies, Chris Ray and Lisa Berg. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you guys have in the question section of the talk, and I will turn it over to Megan to tell you a little bit about the Front Range Pika project.
Hi everybody, can you all hear me? Great, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so my name is Megan Mueller. I'm a senior conservation biologist with Rocky Mountain Wild, and I co-direct a citizen science project called the Front Range Pika Project. And fortunately for us, Joanna Varner and Chris Ray, another researcher in the region who's been studying pikas for years, are both on our science advisory team. So it's great to have them as part of that, and also to have Joe help us out with events like this. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes telling you about the Front Range Pika Project and opportunities for you to get involved in the project this year. And then I think we'll go on to answer all your burning questions about pikas. So the Front Range Pika Project is a partnership between my organization, Rocky Mountain Wild, and the Denver Zoo. And it's a citizen science initiative that engages volunteers in studying American pika in Colorado. We started the project in 2010 when some of the early research was coming out from Eric Beaver and others about what was happening to pikas in the Great Basin. So we knew there was some concern around climate change, but we didn't have any idea how pikas were doing in Colorado. So we partnered with Colorado Parks and Wildlife and started monitoring pikas at 45 sites across Colorado's Front Range. And then in 2018, we expanded the project, and now we're doing research in the White River National Forest and Rocky Mountain National Park, as well as continuing our long-term research along the Front Range. And so we have a few goals. One is just to determine the status of American pika in Colorado. We don't have a really good sense for how pika are doing across the state. Before we started the project, there wasn't even very much information on the distribution of pikas, so we didn't even really know where they were. And then the second goal is to get a clearer picture of how climate change may impact pikas and also alpine ecosystems. And the project is collaborative, so we partner with some of the agencies that manage public land and pika habitat, and then the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, which manages wildlife in Colorado. And we want to be providing those agencies with accurate, reliable, and useful scientific data. We also partner with researchers who are doing a variety of different types of research on American pika and use our data for those purposes. And we want to educate and engage the public. So we want people to know about pikas, to understand potential threats to pikas, and to get involved in conservation of pikas and alpine ecosystems. And then finally, this project was Rocky Mountain Wild's first citizen science initiative, and we've used it as a model for additional collaborative citizen science programs. So Jo, in her presentation, mentioned that we are seeing pikas disappear from sites that were historically occupied in the Great Basin. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about how pikas are doing here in Colorado in the Southern Rocky Mountains. So there have been about 3 recent efforts to do the same kind of surveys in the Southern Rockies that were done in the Great Basin, where folks go to sites that we know had pikas in the past and try to find out whether pikas are still present there. And none of those studies have found evidence of substantial loss of pika populations here in the Southern Rockies. And so some researchers think that pikas may be a little bit more resilient to climate change here because we have really extensive pika habitat at higher elevations and in areas that are a little bit colder than out in the Great Basin. However, there's been some other recent research that came out of Rocky Mountain National Park that predicts that pikas may be lost from Rocky Mountain National Park during this century under climate change scenarios. So even though we're not seeing major losses of populations here yet, we're definitely concerned about how pika will do with climate change moving forward. And in addition, some of the recent surveys that Front Range Pika Project volunteers have done over the past couple of years have found sites where we're only finding very old pika sign and we're not finding any new pika sign and no pikas are present. And so that could just be a site where the pika that was there died for some reason, it got eaten by a weasel. But it could also be sites where we are starting to see those losses of pika populations, and we'll be doing some additional survey work at those sites to try to figure out which of those it is. And so as the climate continues to change, we're concerned about how pika will do in this region. And we need citizen science here to try to get baseline information on the current distribution of pikas. So get good data on where pikas are now. We also need citizen scientists to help us collect data that can help researchers predict the impacts of climate change. It's really useful if we can learn enough about what pika need in their habitat, what temperature ranges they can stand, and those kinds of things to kind of inform predictions about climate change. And then we also need long-term monitoring. So we need people to be going back to the same sites every year so that if we start to lose populations, we can detect those losses. And all of this data, the purpose of it all is to help the agencies that manage pika habitat come up with strategies to try to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We know the climate is going to change. We're concerned it's going to affect pikas. And researchers have some ideas about ways we might be able to help pikas survive under climate change scenarios. But we just don't know enough yet to really put any of those ideas into practice. So that's why we need citizen scientists. This map shows you the areas where the Front Range Pika Project is doing research. We have one research effort in Rocky Mountain National Park in partnership with the Park Service. And then we have one along the Front Range in partnership with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and one in the White River National Forest in partnership with the Forest Service. And in those 3 areas combined, we're sending citizen scientists out to monitor over 150 sites where there's pika habitat in Colorado. So now you might be wondering if you can volunteer for the Front Range Pika Project if you don't already. And so typically every summer we recruit new volunteers to attend classroom and field trainings and then conduct pika surveys at long-term monitoring sites. And we do this for each of our study areas. And those trainings are usually in late July or early August, sometimes earlier depending on snowpack. But unfortunately this year we're suspending our in-person volunteer trainings because of social distancing requirements and also some budget and staffing cuts the project has had related to COVID-19. So we're not recruiting new volunteers to do surveys at our long-term monitoring sites this summer because that requires some fairly intensive training, and you have to be in a big group and ride on buses together and do a lot of things that probably are not safe or appropriate right now. However, we're hopeful that we're still going to have opportunities for you to volunteer with us this year and help us out. We're actually working right now on creating an app that volunteers will be able to use to record pike observations anywhere in Colorado. So you could view some online training materials and then go out on your own and hike to any pika habitat along trails anywhere in Colorado and record pika observations and some other information for us. And this data is going to be really valuable. And so we're not quite sure yet when that app will be finished, but we're aiming to have it done in time for volunteers to be able to help us test it out this summer. So we'd like to have some volunteers taking the app out, recording observations of pikas, and then telling us how it works so we can improve it. So you can email us at the email address on my screen, which is frpp@rockymountainwild.org, if you'd like to sign up to hear about opportunities to test the app this summer. And then we can also put you on our email list for 2021 volunteers. We are hoping that we'll be able to do our normal trainings and have our volunteers go out to long-term monitoring sites in 2021. And if you sign up to be on the list for that, you'll be one of the first folks to know about that. You can also learn more about the project at www.pikapartners.org. And then I'd like to take a minute just to thank all of our partners and sponsors and funders. We get a lot of great support from all the organizations you see here on the screen. We have a great team of science advisors, and our work is made possible by our really amazing and very dedicated volunteers. So that's all I have for today, and I think we can move on to answering all of your fun and interesting pika questions. And I think I can hand it over to Chris to moderate that. Great.
Okay, so the first question we had was from Olivia. Olivia asks, are there any major differences in adaptation between American pika and collared pika?
I can take that one, and the short answer is not really. So they're about the same size and shape. They have the collared pikas have a slightly different coloring. So they have they're called collared pikas because they have a little sort of a stripe of kind of white fur around their neck, but they have a really different sounding call. So if you get an opportunity, I don't have any recordings with me, but I would encourage you to Google what a collared pika sounds like. And but otherwise there's not a huge difference between them. They're ecologically very similar.
Okay, the next question comes from Sarah. Sarah asks, it's incredible that pika live under snowpack tunnels all winter. How do they get enough oxygen?
So Megan, please feel free to chime in if you want to take any of these. This one I actually had to ask. Kick the can up to a higher level expert. But Chris Ray, who we both have mentioned as being a collaborator and a science advisor for the Front Range Pika Project, said that she believes there's plenty of snow-free space underneath the talus, so there probably is actually a lot more air circulation than what you would expect, just thinking about the snow on top of the rocks, because some of those talus slopes are really quite deep. And in fact, she suggested that probably it's easier for pikas to breathe under the snow, under the talus, than it is for bears that are hibernating in a den, just in terms of the amount of airflow.
The next question comes from Brenna. Brenna asks, what determines what is good data for citizen scientists?
That one, Joe?
Go ahead.
You can start. So we work pretty closely with our science advisors to decide what data researchers need, and then to train our volunteers to collect good data. And really the main thing is that you're collecting the data in a way that scientists can be confident about it. So for example, when you tell us you saw a pika, we need to know where you saw it. And it's really helpful to have an exact location with that data. If you just tell us you saw a pika somewhere in Rocky Mountain National Park, then that's kind of less useful data. So that's one example of the data. We need data with specific locations. It's really helpful to have things like pictures so that we can confirm that you saw a pika and not another small mammal that looks like a pika. So those kinds of things are good data. Joe, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that, so as part of our, for those of you guys who are here from Cascades Pika Watch, probably know that we have also sometimes have multiple teams of volunteers survey the same site and come back and report what they saw. And that gives us an idea of sort of the repeatability of different methods. And that also helps us to identify if there are any volunteers that are kind of struggling to be able to get the same information as everybody else, that we can provide them with a little bit of extra resources and training to make sure that the data that they're collecting are reliable.
And I would say generally, we've gotten really good data from our volunteers. The data has been used in peer-reviewed scientific publications and for all kinds of, to answer all kinds of different research questions. So citizens can really collect great data.
Yeah.
Great. So we had a question from Joe about the website. So I wanted to repeat that website. It's just pikapartners.org. So the next question comes from Melinda. Melinda asks, what do pika like to eat?
I can answer that one. I would say that mostly plants, any kind of plant. They're not super picky. They're what we call generalist herbivores, which just means that they eat a little bit of anything. They can eat plants that are pretty toxic if they eat them in relatively small quantities, or they can take toxic plants and store them in their hay piles. And over the winter, those toxins break down and actually act as a natural preservative. Some populations of pikas have slightly different diets than others, depending on what's around. So the pikas that I work with in the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon actually tend to kind of specialize on moss. About 60% of their diet is moss. But most pikas don't live in areas where there's that much moss to eat, and so they don't eat it.
The next question comes from Olivia. Olivia asks, should pika be considered endangered?
So that one is a little bit of a tricky question, but it's, I mean, there's different ways of kind of considering a species to be endangered. So if you look at the whole species of pikas, there's lots of different populations of pikas that seem to be in a lot of trouble. Other populations of pikas that seem to be a little bit more stable. That's one of the big reasons why we need organizations like the Front Range Pika Project, is, you know, to help us be able to understand exactly what's happening across the whole range of the pika. And that's actually one of the petition for the Endangered Species Act is one of the sort of catalysts that started a lot of these different citizen science projects, trying to gather more information on the status and distribution of pikas across the range. So in sort of short answer to that question, I guess I would say that it's just really variable across the range of the species. Megan, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's right, and definitely part of what we're trying to do here in Colorado is figure out, you know, if pikas are at risk because of climate change in Colorado, and we just don't know that yet. So we're in one of the regions where there's some uncertainty about that question.
The next question comes from David. David asks, is the Front Range Pika Project opportunistic app targeted to be used by trained pika patrollers only or by everyone?
It's targeted to be used by everyone, and we're planning to set it up so that you can just view kind of simple training materials online or on posters that we'll put up by trailheads. So any volunteer, any place in the state should be able to use that app. And it should be pretty simple to use, but it'll also be set up to collect some important data for us.
The next question comes from Sarah. Sarah asks, can you elaborate on how social pikas are? If they are territorial, are they mainly solitary animals who stick to their own territories, but yet they rely on each other for warning calls?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. They tend to be pretty solitary and pretty territorial. You don't see them, interacting very often, except for when the babies are born in the spring. Mom will tolerate the babies in her territory for a couple of months, and you'll sometimes see them interacting with each other. And then come about late July, early August, mom actually kicks the babies out of home, like go, seek your fortune elsewhere. And she'll actually chase the babies out of her territory and start defending her territory against her own babies. So they live typically, they live in these big rock slides where you've got lots and lots of different territories all right next to each other. And they do warn each other about predators, but their alarm calls also can serve the function of, sort of protecting their own territory from other individuals.
They steal each other's hay.
Sometimes.
The next question comes from Jeremy. Jeremy asks, why are pika an important species beyond their incredible cuteness?
They actually, from sort of a broader ecological perspective, there have been some studies that have shown that pikas are a really important prey base for things like weasels in particular. And they also can have really important nutrient cycling implications. So they're going out and they're gathering food in the meadow and they're bringing it back into their hay pile. And what you'll see is that oftentimes new hay piles are always built on old hay piles, almost always under the same rock. And so by years and years and years of pikas bringing vegetation into the rocks, they actually affect the rate of talus infill. So there can actually be soil that is generated from decaying plant matter from the hay piles in which new plants can grow close to the hay pile. So they can affect nutrient cycling in that way. There's some evidence that pikas can be an indicator species of sub-talus water resources. And of course, water resources in the mountains are of interest for lots of different reasons. So pikas could be an indicator species of, the sort of broader health of alpine ecosystems.
Okay. The next question comes from Terry. Terry asks, what trends are we seeing from the data collected by the Pika partners?
So far, what we're seeing at our long-term monitoring sites is that they're consistently occupied by pika from year to year. And so, like I said in the presentation, we're not seeing losses of pika populations at most of our sites. But in the last couple of years, we have found some sites, especially in White River National Forest and Rocky Mountain National Park at lower elevations where we're seeing pika sign that's really old. And one thing that's interesting about pika poop in hay piles is that they can stay around in the environment for decades after pikas are gone. So you can find old sign in places where pika might not be present anymore. And that's what I think that we're starting to see at some of those sites. But, there's also kind of year-to-year stuff that can happen that can confuse that signal. So, there could have been a pika there that year and the pika just got eaten by a weasel or something, and another pika might come back and colonize that area in the future. But from the evidence that we've been seeing at those sites and how old the sign looks, I do think we're seeing some sites where there probably were a lot of pikas in the past and pikas aren't present there now. And so we'll be kind of doing more intensive surveys at those sites to make sure that that's the case, and also thinking about looking at what that might be linked to. What is the reason for that? Is that because of climate change? And so we still need some more research to figure those things out, but that's what we're seeing so far.
The next question comes from Ari. Ari asks, why do you think pikas are more stressed at higher elevations?
So that is something that we found just in 2019, and so I should highlight that we're going to sort of repeat some aspects of that study as much as possible in the next couple of years and see if it's a trend that we see more broadly or if it was just this past year. My expectation is that from this past year, it was particularly in the La Salles because there was this really, really dense extra winter snowpack and a lot of avalanche activity at high elevations. So the Pikas at the highest elevations, they actually still had snow over their territory into August. And so what that means is that compared to most years, they lost out on 4 to 6 weeks of foraging time. Many of them may have not had a lot to eat during that time, so they might have really run low on food, which could lead to stress. And they may have been trying to, at that time when we were able to actually access the scat to collect, they could have been trying to sort of overcompensate for a really short foraging season. So it'll be interesting to see if that same pattern holds this year with a lot less winter snowpack.
The next question comes from Olivia. Olivia asks, is it Pika or Pikas? What do you call a baby Pika and what do you call a group of Pikas?
So the plural of Pika is Pikas. So a lot of people use the plural of Pika as just Pika. So like our Pika changing their distribution. But I think that technically it is our Pikas changing their distribution. What do you call a baby Pika? Adorable. But there isn't any special term besides just the most adorable thing you've ever seen. And what do you call a group of Pikas? A population? A herd? I don't know. I sometimes call them a herd. I don't think that's probably right. I would say probably just a group of Pikas.
The next question comes from Andrew. Andrew asks, what do you anticipate with the snowpack this year?
My experience with the snowpack this year is that it's not like last year. So last year there was a really sort of abnormally high winter snowpack in a lot of places, and my experience is that this year it's a lot lower. So I expect that it seems like there was enough that probably there was still a good layer of insulation, but not so much that that it's going to affect winter or spring foraging right now. So we'll see what happens out there. But I expect probably it was a good winter for Pikas if they were able to amass enough food from last summer.
The next question comes from Deborah. Deborah asks, I'd love to hear more about the variation between Pika dialects.
Yeah, so there's actually a really lovely paper about this from the 70s. And there was a scientist named, I think his name was Preston Summers. And he actually did some really interesting things where he had Pikas from the northern Rocky Mountains and from the southern Rocky Mountains. He noticed that they had really different calls, and he actually was able to keep some of them in captivity and breed them together and show that the hybrid of the two populations had a call that was intermediate in frequency. And so he was the one who actually was able to demonstrate that it had to do with the mouth anatomy, basically, to make those different dialects of calls. But there is a lot of variation. So if you do go hiking outside of the southern Rocky Mountains, you'll notice that the Pikas actually sound a little bit different. And you can look for recordings of Pikas from different parts of their range. I used to do a little bit of work in the Uinta Mountains outside of Salt Lake City when I was in grad school. And the Uinta Mountains have a unique subspecies that's only found in that mountain range, and they have a much lower pitched call. So the Pikas in Colorado, they sound a little bit more like right? And the Pikas in the Uintas are like And the first time that I heard one, I thought, oh my gosh, you just sound so sad and so pathetic. But it's actually just a dialect. So.
Okay. The next question comes from Terry. Terry asks, what are some of the possible mitigations that researchers are considering to save Pika from the impacts of climate change?
So that one is a little bit tricky, right? Because obviously the root of the problem, climate change, is a lot bigger than just Pikas. But definitely there have been some ideas that have been kicked around, specifically looking at different kinds of mitigations for helping to improve the microclimates under the rocks. And so we can't exactly go around installing air conditioners, but some of the suggestions that folks have looked at is maybe using downed wood on talus as a way of changing microclimates. There's a little bit of data that suggests that, and this actually was generated by a citizen science project in the Tetons, where volunteers were reporting seeing hay piles in slash piles and down wood off of regular talus. And so, of course, they submitted this observation. Researchers were like, okay, we'll be the judge of whether or not those are actually pikas living in wood piles, because that's not a thing. And then they went out there, and indeed, actually, the pikas had set up shop in the wood piles. And when they put out some temperature sensors, what they found is that the temperatures in the wood piles were actually less extreme. So during the summer, they were cooler in the wood than it was in the talus, and during the winter, it was actually warmer in the wood than it was in the talus. And this has led to at least sort of a broad level suggestion that, maybe things like adding more down trees, especially if there's different kinds of thinning, or after fires or something like that, where you have a lot of down wood, looking at potentially putting things like that on the talus to help mitigate those microclimates. That's just one idea. Other things people are looking at and considering are trying to understand what kinds of human use factors or different kinds of modifications would affect pikas. Things like looking at whether or not they are affected by grazing in close proximity to the talus, and then potentially trying to mitigate the effects of grazing, things like that.
And I think if we knew more about, we think there's going to be some variation between different sites and how pikas do with climate, just because, sites on north-facing slopes are cooler and sites on south-facing slopes are warmer, and there's a lot of variation in the microclimates at different sites. And so if we could figure out, which sites are going to be best for pika under climate change scenarios, we might also be able to focus some of those efforts in those locations. So maybe those are the sites where you pile up wood, or where you prevent grazing, or don't build trails up to 14 years that are going to be really busy, or those kinds of things. So lots of ideas, but I think lots of research that we still need to do to be able to implement any of those things.
Yep.
Okay, the next question comes from Debbie. Debbie asks, how do you catch them?
Good question. Usually we use traps, and so it's basically like a little metal cage, and you open up the trap door, and then we bait it with native vegetation and sometimes with apples. You have to build the trap into the rock in order to try and protect it from both sun and from predators, so that once they get in the trap, then they're safe. And then we have to check the traps really, really, really frequently, because they can just freak out from stress and die in the trap. And that is not the goal of my research. But and so I haven't had any problems trapping them in the LaSalle's. I had a really, really hard time trapping them in the Columbia River Gorge as part of my PhD. We spent a tremendous amount of time. We tried everything. And, we even tried to invent a little trap. It was like a total Elmer Fudd kind of situation, where we had a net, and we put some snacks on the net, and then there was a rope around the outside of the net that went up over a tree, and then my field assistant was sitting in a tree and was going to pull up the pika in the net, and it didn't work, of course, but some populations seem easier to trap than others.
Okay. The next question comes from Olivia. Olivia asks, have pikas ever been seen sharing dens with a marmot?
So that was another question that I had to ask another expert about. And what she found, she said, Chris Ray said that on Niwot Ridge, they frequently see pikas sharing dens with marmots, especially as a nursery. So when mom is about ready to give birth, she very frequently actually does so in or very near a marmot den. So it's not something that I've observed very much, but apparently is something that does happen. They also do sometimes cache and eat marmot poop. So there's that.
Okay. The next question comes from Jeremy. Jeremy asks, you mentioned land managers potentially taking action to protect pika. What ideas are there around protecting pika?
I guess I would say, again, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done on that in terms of what kinds of actions are really likely to be effective. But some of the things that they're looking at are, different kinds of actions that can help to make it nicer microclimates under the rock, so cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. Trying to look at sort of making sure that there's enough vegetation around to support the population of pikas, and then also, trying to understand how trails and recreation. But like Megan mentioned, still a lot that we don't know in that area, and a lot of research that needs to be done.
And the next question comes from Megan. Megan asks, what can I do to help pika conservation efforts if I don't live near the Rocky Mountains?
There's a few things that you can do. One thing is you can help with efforts to address climate change in your area. So you could look at the carbon that you or your family uses and try to reduce your carbon footprint by doing things like driving less and riding your bike and walking more. And there's lots of resources you can find online for doing that. The more that we can kind of bring down our carbon emissions and slow down climate change, the better off pika will be. So that's a really great thing that you can do. You can also donate to the project, the Front Range Pika Project, or to Rocky Mountain Wild. And they're depending on where you live, there are a bunch of citizen science projects in states other than Colorado. So there's one in Montana, there's the one Cascades Pika Watch that Joe works on in Oregon. So you might be able to get involved in one of those. And if you ever visit places that have pikas in the Western US, you could use our app to make pika observations. Joe, do you have other thoughts on that? Things people could do?
Nope, I think that's it. And, tell your friends about pikas and how cool they are.
So we have about 5 minutes left and quite a number of questions. Are you two okay with going a little over time?
Yeah. With me.
So the next question comes from Debbie. Debbie asks, with so many areas closed, will this help current pika populations?
That's a good question, and it's one that that I definitely have been thinking about. I guess I would say pikas are typically not really that bothered by people, and in fact, usually what'll happen if you go out to watch them is that they'll come out and they'll seem a little bit bothered by you and call at you a couple of times, and then they'll just go about their business and pretend that you're not there. So my expectation is that not having people on the trails, directly in terms of how that affects pika is probably pretty minimal kinds of changes in terms of whether it benefits them. I could imagine that not having people wandering around could potentially change predator behavior in some way that might affect pikas, but again, that would just be totally conjecture. I don't have any evidence to support that.
I think sort of indirectly, the fact that so many people are not driving as much is probably good overall for the climate and for pikas, so it might help them kind of indirectly in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the next question is from Olivia. Olivia asks, could you elaborate on the pika breeding season? Are pikas changing breeding habits due to climate change?
Yeah, so I asked Chris Ray about that one as well. And the breeding season is mostly March through June. So typically mom will have a litter of 2 babies, and they'll sort of emerge a couple of maybe 6 to 8 weeks after they're born. They'll start running around the territory. And then in late July or early August, she'll actually kick them out of the territory, and they have to go find a vacant territory and build a hay pile in order to survive the winter. Sometimes mom has a second litter in August, and in most places that's typically not a very good plan, because it's really hard for the babies to get big enough and then find a vacant territory. So usually the second litter babies, the only times that they survive is if they happen to inherit a hay pile that the owner died early. The things may be a little bit different for that in places like the Columbia River Gorge, where you don't have this really deep, long, persistent snowpack in winter, and where it's a little bit easier to find food year round. Chris Ray said that she actually looked for changes in the timing of juvenile weight in terms as like evidence of changing birth dates. She doesn't have enough data to say anything conclusive yet, but that there may be a trend in that direction. But one thing that she is definitely finding is that there are fewer young per adult captured up at Niwot Ridge now than there were in the 90s. So in the 1990s, she was capturing a lot of juveniles for each adult. Nowadays, she's capturing a lot fewer juveniles per adult, suggesting that reproductive rates are potentially reducing. Good news, though, we got a lot of babies last year in the La Salles.
Okay, the next question comes from Deborah. Deborah asks, can you tell us about pika dens in winter life? Is it all eating, pika Netflix, and making more pikas? What are the dens like?
So that was another question that I asked for Chris Ray, and she said that we don't actually know very much about dens, but that she knows that pikas can survive in like a nest box underground in Durango. That was some of those experiments I mentioned in the 60s where they were looking at calls. She's talked with some folks who think that pikas, they must slow down their metabolism a little bit during the winter, sort of like a not quite hibernation, but you know, maybe not being as active. But there's not really any evidence about that. She did one study where they put radio collars on the pikas, and they then went out in the snow on skis and sort of located where they were throughout the winter. And it seemed like they kind of hunkered underneath the deepest drifts of snow and just didn't really move very much. So they pretty much just found remember the deepest snow is probably going to be the warmest place under the snow. And they just kind of hunkered down there and ate their food. So it's a good question. It's something that we don't really know about. I've always dreamed of doing some more winter field work so that I would have to go backcountry skiing all winter. I haven't figured it out yet.
Okay, the next question is from Allison. Allison asks, how do pikas stay cool in the Columbia River Gorge?
Okay, great question. So the Columbia River Gorge is such a unique place. It is really warm in the summer at the temperatures that we would experience hiking around, and it seems almost inconceivable that there would be pikas there at those temperatures. But we measured the microclimates in the rocks, and what we found is that actually the temperatures about 3 feet below the surface of the rock in a lot of places in the Columbia River Gorge are like, I called it a magical pika paradise. It's like a cool and constant somewhere around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, about 3 feet below the rocks. And it's 40 degrees all day, all night. It's, you know, roughly the temperature of your refrigerator. And we think that there's a couple of things going on there that's causing that. One of them might be subsurface ice features. So the talus there is really, really deep. And on the north-facing sides, you know, with really deep talus, there's a potential that there's actually, you know, the snow and ice kind of percolate down there during the winter and then, you know, stay down there and help to cool it. The other thing that we have a little bit of evidence for is we did a little bit of experiments looking at the effect of moss cover on the surface temperature. And we found that the moss cover may actually act like an evaporative cooler. So the moss cover is somewhat, in some places it's like 7 to 10 inches thick. And when it rains, it can hold on to moisture for a very, very long time. As that moisture evaporates, it cools the space underneath it. It's exactly like a swamp cooler. But I used to give talks about this in Oregon, and I'd be like, you guys, it's like a swamp cooler. And they would all be like, blah, 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 because nobody in Oregon uses swamp coolers because they don't work. So if you are familiar with a swamp cooler, the moss is acting kind of like one out there and helping to provide those really nice, cool microclimates. It was really interesting and really surprising when we found that, because actually the temperatures in low elevations in the Columbia River Gorge were cooler and more constant. So, you know, overall more favorable for pikas than in the sort of typical habitat on treeline on the big Cascade volcanoes like Mount Hood, which is really not what we expected.
Okay. The next question comes from Katrina. Katrina asks, do they live in pairs or have any sort of family structure?
They tend to live by themselves in a territory by themselves, and they tend to basically, they call it, in the science literature, they call it facultatively monogamous, which means basically like monogamous just because it's convenient, and they pretty much always mate with whoever's next door. So they usually have territories that are adjacent, male, female, and then they just get together with the neighbor. And that's who they mate with because they're handy.
Okay. The next question comes from Charlotte. Charlotte asks, we have a home in Keystone. What can we do?
I can answer that one. So Keystone is actually it's surrounded by the White River National Forest. So it's one of the places where the Front Range Pika Project is doing research. So if you like to get out hiking, we definitely would love to have you sign up to test out the app this year in your area. And then next year you could join the project to help out with the long-term monitoring. And then I also think a lot of local communities in Colorado are thinking about how to reduce carbon emissions at a local scale. So that's another way you could help out is by getting involved in any of those kinds of initiatives in Keystone.
Okay, the next question comes from Sarah. Sarah says, can you talk more about pika reproduction? Any special mating rituals or preferences? How long they're pregnant? How many in a litter? How many litters do they have per summer?
Yeah, so I touched on a little bit of this. Basically, the mating usually happens under the snow. So for that reason, we don't really know very much about it. I can't imagine it's very romantic since they just mate with their neighbors and they're all under the snow. But who knows what kind of rituals are happening down there. In terms of pregnancy, I can't remember exactly how long a pregnancy lasts, but it's a couple of weeks. Mom usually has 2 babies in a litter, and usually 1 litter per summer. That's born sometime between March and June. They typically try to time it so that the babies are born right when the snow is melting and when fresh vegetation is available, so that there's plenty for mom to eat while she's lactating. And then occasionally, like I mentioned, they have a second litter later in the summer in late July or early August. But it's pretty rare that those animals are able to make it unless they inherit a hay pile that somebody else has made.
And the last question we have is from Andrew, and this one's specific to Joe. So you haven't had any luck at all bringing your skis on a pika expedition?
That's not quite true. I did a couple of years ago. I had a student who was doing a stress hormone study, a little bit like the one that I told you about, but we were sampling closer to the San Juans and areas around Aspen and Crested Butte. And so I graciously volunteered to help survey some higher elevation spots by hiking up with my skis to skin up to get pika poop in the rocks and then skiing back down. So I have had some luck in the spring. I just haven't really done it much in the winter.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have today. Did either of you two have something you wanted to add just for fun, or before we close it out?
I don't think so. I just really appreciate everyone joining us and being interested in pikas and in trying to help conserve pikas. It's inspiring to me that there are so many of you out there who care.
Yep. And yeah, thank you guys for coming. If you have more pika questions, I love talking about pikas. I have a bunch of pika t-shirts and I just love them. So you're all, any of you are welcome to get in touch with me on either social media or look up my email. And I'd be happy to answer questions if I can, if you have them.
Oh, Deborah has a question. Deborah asked, wait, there are pika t-shirts?
Yes, look, I found this at the Patagonia store. And Rocky Mountain Wild, I think actually, Chris, isn't some of your stuff in a Redbubble store? There's some really, really fabulous art that you can buy on different websites, t-shirts, dresses, etc.
Actually, we can post things on that Facebook event page. I'm going to link to it. Scott asked earlier, and I should just link it to everyone. But we're going to post some resources. Joe, if you don't mind, we can put your email on there.
Sure.
And I'll do the Redbubble if anyone's interested. But that looks like that's the end of our questions. I'm just going to post this real quick. And I want to thank everyone for coming today and remind you that tomorrow we're going to be talking about bats, and on Friday we're going to have Endangered Species Day parade. So if you have any creative outlets, art, makeup, whatever you want, costume, and want to join the parade, be sure to register. It's Friday at noon, and the bat talk tomorrow will be Friday at noon. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Joe and Megan for sharing everything with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm not seeing any more questions, so we're going to close it out. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.